I need to check the used names list carefully before writing. The story will feature a grandmother, narrator, 60, whose son brings home a new wife who doesn't realize the grandmother owns the family business/property. I'll create all new names not in the list. Names to avoid. From file: Eleanor, Serena, Lorraine, Cora, Dorothy, Vivian, Agnes, Marcus, Nadine, Patricia, James, Sabria, Russell, Fiona, Brett, Celeste, Nathan, Renata, Harriet, Miriam, Lily, Derek, Thomas, Grandma, Wesley, Vivian, Garrett, Carol, Conrad, Audrey, June, Bevany, Bevan, Garrett, Carol, Conrad, Audrey, June, Bevany, Diane, Vera, Gwen, Philip, Helen, Suzanne, Connie, Paula, Lucille, Margot, Rosalie, Kathleen, Winifred, Elliot, Ivy, Britton, Gloria, Leland, Tammy, Ray, Iris, Margot, Holt, Warren, Deb, Margaret, Millie, Dara, Patrice, Caulfield, Stephanie, Barbara, Adaze, Cecily, Kelsey, Ruthie, Nora, Sylvia, Patrice, Caulfield, Stephanie, Barbara, Adaze, Cecily, Kelsey, Ruthie, Nora, Sylvia, Todd, Robert, Tricia, Beverly, Claudette, Adrian, Simone, Felix, Paulette, Prescott, Theo, Marilyn, Colton, Renee, Hadley, Mabel, Griffin, Leonard, Greta, Kyle, Amber, Wanda, Joanne, Tess, Lena, Marco, Douglas, Harper, Joelle, Vincent, Claire, Delphine, Aldine, Evan, Francesca, Petra, Evelyn, Noel, Breck, Cressida, Linda, Audra, Preston, Doris, Crystal, Dot, Octavia, Sunita, Frederica, Joelle, Brant, Meredith, Ruthann, Loretta, Miles, Genevieve, Alma, Juniper, Callum, Mavis, Denny, Caroline, Suzette, Rosario, Devon, Hargrove. New names I'll use: Ida, narrator, grandmother; Colby, son; Priscilla, daughter-in-law; Frank, late husband; Gil, son's friend. It happened on a Wednesday, the kind of gray October afternoon where the light through the kitchen window looks like it gave up halfway. I was rinsing the same coffee cup I'd rinsed 100 times before when my son knocked. He never just walked in anymore, even though I'd told him 1,000 times he didn't need to knock. He stood in the doorway with his jacket half-zipped, and that look he always got when he needed something but was too proud to lead with it. I dried my hands and said, "Come in, Colby," like I hadn't already seen everything I needed to see in the set of his shoulders. He sat at the kitchen table and picked at the edge of the placemat the way he used to do as a boy when he was building up to something. He told me the lease on his apartment was ending in November, that the firm he'd been contracting for had gone quiet on 2 projects, that he was fine, just in a tight spot for a few months. I didn't make him say the rest. I knew what he needed. I told him about the bakery building, not the bakery itself. That was still running, had been running for 22 years under my name, under the name Frank, and I built from a rented storefront and a second-hand commercial oven. But the building had an upstairs, 3 rooms and a full bath that I'd used for storage since Frank passed, since I didn't have the heart to do anything else with it. I'd thought about renting it out 12 times and talked myself out of it every time. Colby knew the space. He'd grown up spending Saturday mornings there, restocking shelves and eating the day-old scones I let him pick from the reject basket. "Take the upstairs," I told him, "until you get back on your feet. It's just sitting there." He looked at me the way he always does when he doesn't want to take something from me but wants it anyway. Then he nodded, quiet, like we'd settled a business arrangement. I handed him the spare key on the old brass ring that still had a little wooden lobster charm on it from a trip Frank and I took to Maine the year before Colby was born. "Just until things pick back up," he said. "Of course," I said. He was up there 3 months before he mentioned her. Her name was Priscilla. He brought her up in a phone call, not in person, which I noticed. She was in marketing, he said. She was focused, knew what she wanted. He said it in that voice menus when they want you to know they've already made up their mind and they're just informing you. I said that sounded nice and asked if she drank coffee or tea so I'd know what to have ready when I met her. She drank sparkling water with lemon. The first time I met her, she came downstairs wearing a blazer on a Sunday morning, which told me something right away. She shook my hand with both of hers and smiled with everything except her eyes. She had that way of looking around a room while still appearing to look directly at you. The bakery wasn't open that day. I'd closed Sundays since Frank died, kept it for myself. And she walked the front floor slowly, her heels clicking on the tile, picking up small things and setting them down. The ceramic rooster I kept on the counter, the framed photo of the original storefront from 1999. Charming, she said finally, very vintage. I thanked her and offered her one of the lemon tarts I'd made that morning. She took half of one and left the rest on the edge of the plate. Colby watched her the whole time with that particular kind of attention men have when they're hoping you'll like what they like. I smiled and passed the coffee. They moved quickly. That was the word I kept using in my head. Quickly. By February, they were talking about the future the way people do when they've already decided it and are just narrating it back to you. I raised an eyebrow once, gently, and Colby said she made him feel like he was going somewhere. I understood that, I just wasn't sure where. They married that spring in a small ceremony at a botanical garden, 40 minutes outside the city. I sat in the front row and wore the blue dress Frank always liked. I cried at the right parts and held Priscilla's mother's hand during the vows. The reception was elegant, in a way I don't think either of them could have afforded. But I didn't ask. What I noticed in the weeks after was small at first. Small enough that I told myself I was being sensitive. The upstairs apartment was theirs now, in the way that a space becomes someone's when they rearrange it to fit their shape. I understood that. I'd done the same thing when Frank and I first moved into our house, but the changes crept downstairs too, and that was different. Priscilla started coming into the bakery in the mornings before I opened. At first I thought she just wanted coffee. Then I noticed she was looking at things. Standing at the counter with her phone out, photographing the layout. She mentioned once that the font on the menu board was dated. She mentioned once that the display case would look better against the east wall. She said it lightly, the way people do when they're not really suggesting, they're announcing. I let it go the first time. The second time I changed the subject. The third time I said with a smile that the display case had been in that spot since 1999, and I thought we'd leave it there. She looked at me for a moment and then said, "Of course," but something shifted after that. She started referring to the bakery differently, not in big ways, just in the way she used certain words in passing. Phrases like what we're doing with the space or the direction we're taking the brand. I heard her on the phone once, standing in the front doorway, telling someone she was at the family business. She said it with a kind of ownership that I didn't think she was aware of. Or maybe she was. Colby started showing up to help on weekend mornings, which I loved. But Priscilla came with him and she had ideas. Always ideas. A new social media presence. A wholesale account with one of the downtown hotels. A rebrand. She used that word. Rebrand, and I watched her say it like she was sure I'd be grateful. I told her I'd think about it. She told Colby later that evening, loud enough for me to hear from the back kitchen, that I was resistant to growth. I set down the pan I was holding very carefully and counted to 10. What happened next unfolded over 2 weeks in a way that I didn't fully understand until later, when I had all the pieces laid out in front of me. A woman named Dolores, who'd been supplying my flour and sugar wholesale for 11 years, called me on a Tuesday to confirm a meeting. I hadn't scheduled any meeting with Dolores. She said she'd spoken to my daughter-in-law, who had called to renegotiate the supply contract and set up a tasting session for some new product lines. I sat down. I asked Dolores, as calmly as I could, what else they had discussed. There was a whore on her end. She said Priscilla had mentioned that the bakery was transitioning management and that she would be the primary contact going forward. I thanked Dolores and told her I'd be in touch. I hung up and sat in the back kitchen for a long time, listening to the refrigeration unit hum. Then I found the email. I wasn't snooping. I used the same laptop for the bakery books that sits on the counter in the front, and when I opened it that evening, Priscilla's email tab was still open. She'd been using my computer. The message was to a commercial kitchen equipment company. She was inquiring about leasing costs for new display refrigeration units, updated espresso equipment, and a second convection oven. The email was signed with her name and the bakery's address. There was no mention of me. There was no mention that the bakery had an owner who had not authorized any of this. I closed the laptop and called Colby. He didn't answer. I left a message that said I needed to speak with him in the morning, that it was important, and that I wasn't angry, which was mostly true. He came down early before Priscilla was up, which told me he'd understood something from my voice. I had coffee ready and I sat across from him and asked him quietly what Priscilla understood about the bakery. He was quiet for longer than I liked. Then he said she thought it was going to be theirs eventually, that the plan was always to hand it down, that he might have said some things early on that he hadn't corrected since. What kinds of things? I said. He pressed his hands flat on the table. He said that when they first met, he was struggling and she asked about his family and what they had, and he mentioned the bakery and the building. And she asked if he would inherit it, and he'd said probably, yes, something like that. And then things moved fast and he never went back and clarified what probably meant, or what eventually meant, or what my name being on the deed and the business license and every operating account actually meant. I looked at my son. You let her believe she was moving into something that was already hers, I said. He looked at his coffee. She was more confident when she thought I had something behind me. She came for money and I didn't, and I was embarrassed about that. And so she's been running meetings with my suppliers and ordering equipment for my kitchen because she thinks she's the one in charge. He didn't answer, which was an answer. I told him I needed him to be there when I talked to her. I wasn't going to do it alone, and I wasn't going to do it unkindly, but it needed to happen today. He nodded. We waited until 10. Priscilla came downstairs in one of her blazers, already on her phone, and stopped when she saw us both sitting at the kitchen table. She looked at Colby first, then at me, and her expression shifted into something careful and pleasant, which told me she was already reading the room. I told her to sit down. She sat. I told her what I knew. About the call with Dolores. About the equipment email. About the phrasing she'd been using with people. I kept my voice even throughout. I didn't raise it once. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said that she was just trying to help move things forward. That I'd seemed open to her suggestions. That she was trying to build something for their future. I said that I appreciated her energy, but that the bakery was mine. The building was mine. The business license, the supplier contracts, the operating accounts, all mine. That nothing about that was changing without my explicit involvement and agreement. She looked at Colby. You told me it would be ours, she said. He said, eventually. I said, eventually. Her jaw tightened. She stood up and said she needed some air. The back door closed behind her, harder than necessary. Colby looked at me. I'm sorry, Mom. I know, I said. But sorry doesn't undo a call to my flour supplier. He almost smiled. Almost. What happened over the next 3 weeks was something I watched happen the way you watch weather move in. You see the clouds from a distance, you know what's coming, but you can't quite believe it until you're standing in it. Priscilla didn't let it go. She started what I can only describe as a campaign. She began calling herself a co-owner in conversations I learned about secondhand. She told her sister, who apparently told someone else, who told someone who walked into my bakery and congratulated me on bringing family into the business. She registered a business email address using the bakery's name. She designed a new logo without asking and had it printed on 50 business cards she'd apparently already ordered. I found the cards on a Tuesday when I opened the display case and found a small stack tucked between the napkins and the sugar packets. Her name. My bakery's name. Co-owner. I picked up the cards and stood there for a while. Then I called my accountant, a sharp and thorough woman named Bet, who had done my books since the early days. I told her what was happening. She told me to send her everything, which I did, and within 2 days she came back with a clear picture. Priscilla had attempted to access the business banking portal using an email reset. She hadn't gotten in, but she'd tried. Beth told me to call my attorney the same afternoon. His name was Gene, 70 years old, quiet, the kind of man who speaks in complete sentences and never uses two words when one will do. I spread everything out on his desk: the business license, the deed to the building, the supplier contracts, the bank records, the printed email to the equipment company, the business cards. He looked at all of it without speaking for about 4 minutes. Then he said, "She's been operating as though she has authority she was never granted." I said yes. He said we had options, and he outlined them in order of escalation. I told him I wanted to try the direct route first. I went home and called Priscilla into the bakery. Colby was there. I asked him to stay. Priscilla arrived 5 minutes late with that same careful, pleasant expression, and I set the business cards on the counter between us without saying anything. She looked at them. Then she said she was just trying to establish a professional presence for the future, that I was being rigid, that most families would be grateful to have someone willing to put in the work. I told her that I was grateful she was willing to work and that if she wanted to come on in an employed capacity at a fair wage, we could discuss that. But that representing herself as a co-owner of a business she didn't own wasn't ambition, it was misrepresentation. She said, "You are threatened by me." I looked at her for a moment. Then I said, "I built this business the year you were probably in middle school. I'm not threatened by you. I'm correcting the record." She turned to Colby and said, "This is your mother's doing. This is who she is." And Colby, to my surprise, said quietly, "She's right, Priscilla." She looked at him like he'd said something in a language she didn't recognize. He said, "I let you believe something that wasn't true. That's on me. But the bakery is my mother's, and you can't keep doing what you've been doing." She was quiet for a long time. Then she picked up the cards from the counter and walked out. What followed was not quick or clean. It never is. She escalated in the way people do when they feel the ground shifting. She told Colby's friends that I was manipulative, that I'd always hated her, that I'd sabotaged their marriage. She filed a formal complaint with the city's Small Business Bureau claiming she'd been verbally misled about ownership status, a process Gene dealt with in about a week with a letter and documentation. Nothing came of it. She also, apparently, had already been talking to a contractor about renovating the upstairs apartment. I found this out when the contractor called the bakery line looking for Priscilla, since she had given him the bakery number as her contact. He had drawings. She'd made decisions about walls. I told him, very politely, that those plans were not authorized. He said he understood and that he was sorry for the confusion. Colby found out about the contractor from me. He went upstairs and had a conversation with Priscilla that I wasn't part of and don't know the details of. What I know is that he came back down 2 hours later, sat at the kitchen counter, and asked if he could have a cup of coffee. He looked like something in him had unclenched. "She's going to her friend's place in Portland for a while," he said. "She needs space, and honestly, so do I." I poured the coffee and didn't say anything. Some moments don't need words. In the weeks after she left, I found more. An invoice in the bakery's name for a commercial photographer, a branding shoot she'd scheduled without telling me, for a business she'd been telling people she ran. A conversation thread in a local business owner's Facebook group where she'd introduced herself as managing the family bakery and asked for vendor recommendations. 42 responses, all helpful, all addressed to her. I sat with that for a long time. Not because it hurt exactly, more because I understood, then, the scale of what she'd built in her head. She hadn't just been overstepping. She'd been living inside a version of reality where she already owned something, already had something, already was something, and nobody had stopped her. Colby spent a lot of evenings at the kitchen table that month. Sometimes we talked. Sometimes he just sat there with his hands around a mug, and we listened to the street outside. He told me once that he hadn't felt like himself in about 2 years, that he'd been performing a version of himself he thought she needed and had forgotten which parts were real. I said, "The parts that made you come home are real." He didn't say anything, but he stopped picking at the placemat. He filed for divorce in the fall. He said it quietly, like a fact, not a confession. I didn't tell him I thought it was the right call. I just said I supported whatever he decided. He nodded and finished his coffee. That winter, we did something I'd been putting off for years. We renovated the upstairs properly, not the way Priscilla had imagined, with blown-out walls and an open-concept kitchen that would have cost a small fortune, but thoughtfully. New flooring in the main room, fresh paint throughout. I had Frank's old bookcases moved up there from storage, and Colby helped me carry them up the stairs on a Saturday morning while the first snow was coming down outside. He stood the last one against the wall and looked at the row of them and said, "These are good." "They are," I said. We opened the bakery that January with one real change. Colby behind the counter on Saturday mornings, the way he used to be as a kid. He wasn't co-owner, he was my son, helping out. The distinction mattered, and he understood that. One thing at a time, one honest thing at a time. A regular came in that first Saturday, a retired schoolteacher named Willa who'd been coming in since the early days and always ordered an Earl Grey and a plain scone. She looked at Colby behind the counter and smiled. "He must be yours," she said to me. All his life, I told her. She took her scone and her tea and sat in the corner by the window, and the bakery smelled like butter and flour and the particular kind of warmth that doesn't come from the oven alone. I looked at my name on the sign above the door, faded a little from years of weather, still exactly as Frank and I had painted it the day we opened. I hadn't changed it then. I wasn't going to change it now. Some things you build slowly and you keep. That's not stubbornness. That's just knowing what you have. I've thought about this a lot since everything settled, about why it went the way it did, and whether it could have gone differently if I'd spoken sooner. The honest answer is probably yes. I could have handed Colby those keys and said, "Just so we're clear, this building is mine, the business is mine, and none of that changes until I say so." I didn't, because I trusted that the obvious didn't need saying. That was my part in it. But here's what I've come to understand about the way things unfolded with Priscilla. She didn't walk into my bakery as a bad person looking to steal something. She walked in as someone who had decided, quickly, quietly, on her own, what the shape of her life was going to be, and then built everything around that assumption without ever checking whether the ground beneath it was solid. That's not wickedness. That's a particular kind of carelessness that looks like confidence from the outside. She heard what she wanted to hear from Colby, filled in the rest herself, and started acting as though the filling in was fact. The problem with living inside a version of reality you constructed without asking anyone else is that reality itself doesn't adjust to match it. It just waits. What I keep coming back to is Colby. He let it happen not because he was cruel, but because he was ashamed. Ashamed of needing help. Ashamed of not being further along at his age. Ashamed of what he thought Priscilla would think of him if she knew the full picture. And that shame cost him 2 years of his actual life. His friendships, his work, his sense of who he was. He performed a version of himself that had things, because he thought that's what she needed to see, and somewhere in the performance he lost the thread back to himself. I know what it feels like to build something real from very little. Frank and I opened that bakery with almost nothing. We argued over flour costs and stayed up too late doing the books, and some months it was close. But every single thing in that building was ours because we earned it, one honest decision at a time. There is a particular kind of steadiness that comes from knowing exactly what you built and exactly how. Nobody can talk you out of it. Nobody can tell you it isn't yours. That's what I wanted Colby to find. Not the bakery, not the building. His own version of that feeling. The one where you know where you stand because you put yourself there, not because someone else's assumptions placed you. He's getting there. Slowly, the way real things grow. He made the call to the therapist himself. He showed up to reconcile with people he'd let drift. He came back to the counter on Saturday mornings and made coffee and talked to regulars and didn't pretend to be anything other than what he was, a man starting over with his mother nearby in a place that had always been home. Some losses teach you what you actually value. Priscilla's name came off that hypothetical door before it was ever on a real one. Colby's name isn't on the sign above mine, but he doesn't need it to be. He knows what's his, and I know what's mine. That's enough to begin again.